Good evening. I'm Spot On Weather meteorologist Matthew Euler, and welcome to the weekly Teleconnections discussion for 15 October 2021. There's a look at our wonderful planet, the Earth, from space. A lot of different motion occurring on this particular satellite image with the clouds from the atmosphere. I got a very action-packed video tonight to really cover quite a bit of the teleconnections. There's some interesting things here I'll be pointing out. So let's get right into it. I want to start off tonight's video with a look at the global 500 millibar height anomalies for the 15th of October 2021. All right, 500 millibars is up at about 18,000 feet above the Earth's surface, by the way. Now, on the graphic, on that chart on the left, the greens and the blues generally indicate anomalously low 500 millibar heights, while the maroon and orange shadings indicate above normal 500 millibar heights. So wherever you see the orangish or the maroonish colors, that indicates an upper level ridge. And the weather associated with ridges is typically drier with warmer temperatures. And then the blue and the green shading represents areas that are known as troughs. So we're looking at the upper level troughs associated with these 500 millibar heights. And the typical weather with the trough is cooler temperatures and usually unsettled weather. More showery or precipitation is involved with troughs. So if I take a look at the graphic on the left there, some of the major features I wanted to point out on tonight's video is there's an anomalous ridge from New England up into northeastern Canada, and it's extending pretty far north into the higher latitudes. This has been a pretty persistent feature over the last week. It initially started out over central Canada. It has now shifted over into northeastern Canada primarily. Additionally, there's an upper level trough that is located over the central United States, and this is actually moving towards the east. And this deepening trough is going to reach East Coast late Saturday, definitely this Sunday. And it's going to, with that deepening trough and the greater perpendicular component to a surface cold front, that cold front's going to blow through the East Coast and off over the Western Atlantic with time. And it's going to bring a real good taste of fall-like temperatures all the way to the eastern U.S. So that upper level trough is located over the central U.S. And then further west from that, we have an area of upper level heights situated off the coast of California with a little bit of a ridge poking up there along the Pacific Northwest coast. And then further upstream or to the west of that, we have a persistent upper level trough that has been positioned in the Gulf of Alaska. And then further upstream to the west of that, there's an upper level ridge located over the central North Pacific Ocean, just to the west of the Aleutian Islands. We do have a strengthening jet stream, and I can tell you that by the packing of these geopotential height lines, these solid black lines. The more tightly packed they are, the greater the wind speeds. And so I can identify where that jet stream is residing based on this particular chart, based on the packing of those solid dark lines, the lines of equal geopotential height. So we have a strengthening jet stream, which is quite normal as we are now in middle October. We're getting a much larger difference in the temperatures between the polar areas and the equatorial areas, and that thermal gradient is just tightening up, and it's resulting in a tightening height gradient, for example. So generally, this is the pattern what we're looking at. Now, I'm going to move into a discussion of some of the teleconnections. I'm going to start off with the Mad-Julian oscillation. Again, as a reminder, the MJO generally ranges from phases 1 through 8, and I really again like this map because it shows you where the enhanced convection typically occurs with the various phases of the MJO. And again, you wouldn't think that the tropical convection or the activity of thunderstorms in the tropics would really have an impact here in the United States where we live, but it has a huge role in as far as the sensible weather for the winter season, the cool time of year. So again, as a reminder, if I were to tell you, phases 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8, Phase 1 will be associated with the enhanced convection around Madagascar off the coast, east coast of southeastern Africa. Phases 2 and 3 would be enhanced convection in the Indian Ocean. Phases 4, 5, generally associated with convection over the maritime continent there in Australia. Phases 6, 7, and 8 gradually work their way eastward towards international dateline, towards the central Pacific Ocean. So again, just a reminder when we look at this chart. If I look at the MJO temperature composites, they're on the left, for October, November, and December. Again, as I mentioned in last week's video, these temperature composites will not look the same throughout the course of the year. So, for example, when we get to November, I'll throw up the November, December, January composites. And they are going to look a little bit different for the MJO phases on the left. But as of for right now, for the months of October, November, and December, generally, Phase 1 is mild along the east coast of the United States. Phase 2 is cooler over the east coast of the United States. Phase 3 is mild, pretty much from the Rockies eastward to the east coast, including the upper Midwest and northern plains. Phase 4, we have a little cool pocket there just to the south of the Mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas down through Georgia and Alabama and Florida with a Phase 4 this time of year. But most of the country in general is fairly mild. Phase 5, associated with cooler than normal temperatures, below normal temperatures over a good portion of the southern United States. Phase 6, mild throughout much of the country, with the exception of some coastal locations of the East Coast up into New England. Phase 7, generally associated with mild conditions from the southeastern U.S. up to the mid-Atlantic. Much colder air back over to the northern plains with a Phase 7 MJO. And then Phase 8 finally rounds it out. So now let's take a look at the forecast, the latest forecast for the MJO. We're first going to take a look at the GFS Ensemble forecast on the right. This particular time period runs from basically October 14th to the 28th of October for a 2-week period. Pay attention to the green line. That's your NCEP GEFS, GFS Ensemble Forecasting System. That's your forecast there. That green line, we're starting out in a week Phase 6. And we're working our way towards the center, smaller origin circle there to a null phase, according to the latest forecast through 28 October from the GFS Ensemble forecast. If we look at the GFS operational model on the left, also going out through the 28th of October, 2021, generally GFS operational has the MJO in Phase 6. Generally, you're looking at that blue line for the NCEP GFS model in the prediction of MJO, by the way. So we're heading again towards that inner center small circle, which indicates a null phase, no impacts to the United States weather. Now, eventually, the GFS operational around the 27th, 28th of October shows the MJO going into a Phase 2, which is Indian Ocean convection, all right? Phase 2 would be that enhanced convection in the Indian Ocean, right there. All right, and in general, we're moving to Phase 2 again on the GFS operation on the left. Now, the Navy ESPC MJO forecast on the right, generally showing that solid green line. Again, starting out on that border between Phase 5, 6, working our way towards the null phase, that small inner circle. And then coming back out with enhanced convection over the Indian Ocean in Phases 2 and 3, primarily through the end of October, through Halloween on the 31st of October. As far as the La Nina update, just recently came out, NOAA Climate Prediction Center basically just announced officially that La Nina conditions are here. They have been reached. So in general, if you look at the sea surface temperature anomalies in degrees Celsius on the left, just a reminder again that the warmer colors, the oranges and the maroon shading, indicate above normal sea surface temperatures, and the blue shading indicates below normal sea surface temperatures. So a couple things that really stick out on this week's sea surface temperature anomaly chart is we have that blue shading extending from the west coast of South America, working its way along the equatorial area out through the central Pacific, and even a little bit further to the west, just beyond the date line. And that is indicative of the La Nina conditions. We also have a negative PDO look to this. where we get a horseshoe shape of the blue shading there, stretching from the Hawaiian Islands up through off the coast of California, up along the west coast in general of the U.S., and then wrapping back around into the Gulf of Alaska off the west coast of Canada and the Gulf of Alaska, the blue shading. That horseshoe of blue shading, of blue coloring, indicates below normal water temperatures, again synonymous with that negative or the cold phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. The maroon shading there in the central North Pacific shows much warmer water temperatures. More specifically for the Nino 3.4 region on the right, showing the basically the temperature trace, and we're currently sitting at 0.7 degrees Celsius below normal water temps in the Nino 3.4 region, and it has dropped slightly over the course of the past week. Again, I'm very interested in how this negative PDO factors into the winter outlook, so it's going to be interesting as we go through these weekly teleconnection discussions to see if that changes in any regard. All right, so now let's take a look at the Arctic Oscillation forecast, and I explained generally what the Arctic Oscillation, the two phases were on videos in the past couple weeks, as well as last week's teleconnections discussion. But in general, if you want colder temperatures anywhere from the Midwest to the East Coast, you want a negative Arctic Oscillation. If you like mild conditions from coast to coast and more of a zonal west to east jet stream, then you definitely want the positive Arctic Oscillation. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what the forecast is. All right, so the latest European deterministic Arctic Oscillation forecast, this one goes out just around to the 25th of October. And pay attention to those that white circular line there. We're in negative territory right now, according to the European model, and that eventually is going to balance out towards neutral conditions between the 19th and 21st of October before the AO transitions to positive after the 21st of October. Looking at the European EPS AO 50 perturb members, that lighter green line there is indicative of the ensemble mean. The white box line that indicates the European EPS control model. Generally, they're in really good agreement between the models up through the 24th of October, where we're looking at a negative AO transitioning more towards neutral conditions from the 20th to the 21st, and then becoming positive from the 22nd to the 28th of October. Not greatly positive, just slightly above that zero line, slightly positive territory. European EPS AO 50 perturb members. Now this one goes out much further. This is the 46-day forecast. And again, as a reminder, this 46-day forecast generally this model has a tendency to be more positive in the longer range, I've noticed. And so in general, we start off with a negative AO on this model, transitioning to near neutral conditions around the 22nd of October. And generally, it stays close to that green line there, stays fairly close to the zero line, that neutral territory, all the way out through the 28th of November, end of November. And looking at the GFS deterministic AL forecast, you'll notice, we are trending in a negative direction right now, but then on this particular GFS deterministic model, we reach neutral conditions around the 22nd of October, eventually, extending out through about the 24th of October, and then we go positive beyond the 22nd of October, and then approaching neutral again around the 1st of November. Looking at the NCEP the GEFS V12 AO, 30 perturb members model, showing the AO negative and eventually working its way towards neutral around the 21st of October, generally working its way to positive territory after the 22nd of October. Now let's take a look at the North Atlantic Oscillation, NAO. Again, here's your differences in the jet stream setup. In general, what we have going on as far as that jet stream configuration. Positive NAO phase on the left, more of a west to east zonal jet stream with an NAO phase that's positive. A negative phase NAO, we get this huge sprawling area of upper level high pressure, or this huge ridge that works its way into onto Greenland rather, and up into the northwest Atlantic. So there's a big difference between these two. Now let's take a look at what's going on right now. European deterministic NAO forecast, generally looking at negative NAO, transitioning positive around the 22nd of October. So very similar to the AO forecast as far as the European is concerned. The European EPS NAO 50 perturbed members, again comparing the ensemble mean versus the EPS control. More of a spread, of course, beyond 25 October between the white line and that green line. The control wants to make it much more stronger, positive NAO, whereas the ensemble mean wants to keep it fairly neutral. So negative NAO transitioning to neutral is pretty much a good look at this after the 21st of October, pretty much through the end of the month. Looking at the European EPS NAO, 50 perturbed members out to 46-day forecast through 28 November. Generally, what we're looking at here is a fairly neutral NAO, basically starting from 21 October through 28 November, just completely almost like a flat green line there, right? The GFS deterministic NAO forecast showing a negative NAO, eventually transitioning towards neutral around the 21st of October, and then remaining that way out to the end of October. And then the NCEP V12, 30 perturbed members, generally showing the ensemble mean here, the green line, generally showing a negative NAO, becoming neutral after the around the 20th it becomes neutral, and then transitioning positive after the 21st of October. Now on to the Pacific North American forecast. The big difference between the positive phase in the bottom left corner and the negative PNA phase in the bottom right corner is the jet stream configuration. So with a positive PNA, we generally get upper level ridge along the U.S. West, western U.S., all the way up into western Canada, sometimes up into Alaska, and a downstream trough at much cooler temperatures over the Midwest and eastern U.S. On the other hand, we get a negative PNA. We generally get the opposite effect, where we get the jet stream taking on more of a trough configuration over the western U.S., the west coast of Canada, and then we get a downstream ridge over the southeastern U.S. into the mid-Atlantic with a negative PNA. Right, looking at the European deterministic PNA forecast, it's been fairly strongly negative. Look at the values, below -3 in magnitude recently, the PNA, where we've had a fairly persistent trough for about 10 days or so here in October. Well, we're noticing now that the trend in the forecast is transitioning more towards a positive phase from the 20th to the 26th of October, according to the European. That would mean that we would be possibly looking at a pattern change across the United States, where we now replace that trough in the western U.S. with a ridge. And we replace that ridge in the east with a trough. If we look at the European EPS and PNA, 50 perturbed members, generally showing the difference between the control and the ensemble mean, the EPS. And we're heading towards positive territory. Most of the models are indicating this. As you get beyond the 24th of October, there's a much larger spread, of course, the further out in time you get between the control and the ensemble mean. But regardless, they're both in the positive phase for the PNA. European EPS, PNA, 50 perturbed members, out 46 days, out to the 28th of November. Note the negative PNA through the 20th of October, and that's going to transition again to the positive phase, 21 October through 1 November. And then it kind of comes back down towards neutral conditions. Looking at the GFS deterministic PNA forecast, again, strongly negative to start the period, working its way back above that zero line into the positive territory, generally around the 19th to 20th of October, and remaining positive through about the 26th of October before transitioning into more of a neutral condition. And then the NCEP GEFS V12 PNA, 30 perturbed members, that green line showing the ensemble mean, and generally looking at negative becoming positive after 19 October, and then back down towards neutral conditions from the 24th of October to the 31st of October, Halloween. Now on to the Eastern Pacific Oscillation, or EPO forecast. As a reminder, here's your different phases of the EPO, whether it's negative on the left or positive on the right. that makes a big deal. The big difference here is with a negative EPO, you get an upper level ridge into the northeastern Pacific with an area of low pressure in the Hawaiian Islands to the south. With a positive EPO on the right, now the pressure systems are flipped or reversed. You get more of an upper level low, that trough in the Gulf of Alaska, the northeast Pacific, and you get high pressure to the south, a high pressure belt extending across over the Hawaiian Islands and even further westward than that. The other big thing that's different between the negative EPO on the left and the positive EPO on the right is with a negative EPO, you get a much more highly amplified meridional jet stream pattern, which brings in much colder air to the United States. And the positive EPO on the right, that jet stream is pretty much more west to east with the positive EPO. And so this is why we take a look at this. If we look at the European deterministic EPO forecast, you'll notice it's been trending more positive. It's been positive for a little bit, and that would indicate that we have that low pressure there in the Gulf of Alaska and northeastern Pacific, which has definitely been dominating the last 10 days. And eventually, this positive phase EPO transitions negative between the 17th and the 23rd of October, which that would mean that we would switch the pressure systems, right, with a negative EPO, where we get a little bit of an upper level ridge to build into the northeast Pacific with an area of pressure further south. So it would be interesting to see. If we look at the European EPO, 50 perturbed members, we generally have a positive phase EPO right out through the 19th of October, then becoming negative briefly from 19 to 22 October before then going back to positive. The European EPS EPO 50 perturbed members out 46 days, out through 28 November, generally shows a positive EPO through the 20th of October, then briefly negative through the 22nd of October, and then reaching itself back towards positive. The GFS deterministic EPO forecast showing a positive EPO through 20 October, and then becoming briefly negative through 22 October, and then becoming positive once again. One thing I have noticed about the EPO out of all the teleconnections is that it tends to do a lot of like roller coaster type motions. Like you'll be in a positive phase, and then it'll come down to negative, then it'll swing back positive, then come down negative. So this tells me there's a lot of variability in the northeastern Pacific. And then finally, the NCEP GEFS V12 model EPO forecast, 30 perturbed members, the Ensemble mean showing negative conditions, becoming positive through 19 October, but then negative after that before transitioning back to positive beyond 23 October. All right, so now let's take a look at the polar vortex update. I'm going to show you three models and their forecasts. I'm going to show the graphic on the left is the current today, 15 October 2021, state of affairs, and the right-hand graphic in each of these model forecasts that actually is the forecast on the right graphic of each of these slides. So for the GFS forecast, generally orange coloring indicates warming at the 10 millibar level. This is showing you temperature anomalies, these charts at that 10 millibar level, which is at about 18 miles above the Earth's surface in the stratosphere. Green coloring indicates colder temperatures in the stratosphere. All right, so let's take a look here. The graphic on the left, the current GFS state of affairs as far as the temperatures go, you see that there's some stratospheric warming occurring generally to the west of the North Pole right now, the Arctic area. It's to the north of Alaska. And then with time on the right, you notice how that area of stratospheric warming tends to become more circular, symmetrical, and located right over the North Polar area. It moves eastward over time is what I'm getting at. Now, why is this so important? Why is this stratospheric warming so important? It's mainly due to the fact that this could lead to cooler temperatures later down the line, especially in the month of November. So we'll have to keep an eye on that in the eastern United States. Additionally, the polar vortex is expected to become more elongated over time. So this is the GFS forecast. Now let's take a look at the ECMWF, the European. You'll notice that it's very similar, right? The current conditions show that warming taking place north of Alaska, and then generally to the west of Greenland. That graphic on the right shows the forecast for the 25th of October. And again, you notice how that warming tends to become more concentrated right over the North Pole. So that's going to result in some cooler temperatures moving from the Arctic towards the lower latitudes. Now this is the polar vortex forecast for the GFS Ensemble forecasting system. Again, showing a very similar story here, right? So when we look at models in general, we look for consistency in the trend, those trends, that consistency in them. And pretty much the GFS European as well as the GFS Ensemble forecasting system all showing this stratospheric warming anywhere really between 25 and 29 October. And this could really alter the jet stream configuration to produce cooler temperatures, eastern United States, possibly into Eurasia. So this is something to definitely keep an eye on, and this is definitely something worth mentioning and how it could impact our temperatures to cooler temperatures. Additionally, I like to look at the Quasi-biennial Oscillation, the QBO. Now, I added this one. This graphic, by the way, is courtesy of it's courtesy of the World Meteorological Organization, Climate Explorer, and this is really great stuff here. Anything below that zero line is showing an easterly QBO. Anything above the zero line is a westerly QBO. So those easterly QBOs, whenever these red lines are below the zero in a negative territory, that indicates the possibility of colder temperatures in the eastern U.S. Additionally, a easterly QBO tends to favor more of a weakening stratospheric polar vortex in the winter season. So a lot of ups and downs here from westerly phase QBO to easterly phase QBO, but in general, we're expecting that easterly phase QBO. It's currently negative, and we expect it to remain a negative easterly QBO for this winter. So that's going to be something I'm really curious to watch over time, is how does that QBO impact the stratospheric polar vortex? We already have indications in the models that we have stratospheric warming, a weakening stratospheric polar vortex, and we're only in the month of October. Now, does that mean that the polar vortex in the stratosphere will not strengthen after this weakening episode? No, it doesn't. We could be looking at a strengthening polar vortex after this weakening phase. We could see some recovery to it. So just wanted to throw out the QBO, and we're going to keep an eye on this as well as part of our Teleconnections discussion. We definitely need to be paying attention to this and see how this plays into the upcoming winter and that stratospheric polar vortex strength. All right, I wanted to show additional upper level graphics here. We're looking at the European Ensemble prediction system, the 500 millibar geopotential height anomalies, in meters. And again, similar to the first slide I started with in tonight's video, the purple, the blues, the greens indicate troughs, and then that maroon orangish coloring indicates ridges. So if you look at the graphic on the left, that's going to be the forecast for Wednesday, the 20th of October, next Wednesday, the 20th of October, 2021, and look at the strength of that ridge. It almost appears we have like two ridge centers that are extending across west central Canada, as well as another anomalous ridge extending into northeastern Canada into Greenland. And then we have a trough below or underneath that upper level ridge over the northwestern Atlantic in the vicinity of Nova Scotia. The persistent feature of that low pressure, the Aleutian low, that area of low pressure and troughing in the Gulf of Alaska remains. And I'm also keeping an eye on that as far as the EPO state, whether it's positive or negative. In general, by next Thursday, we're looking at a ridge extending from Utah, Colorado, up through Wyoming, Montana into west central Canada. And then we're looking at a trough beneath that ridge, generally extending from Wisconsin through Iowa into Missouri, the central U.S., and another slight ridge along the U.S. East Coast. Look at the graphic on the right, shows the European Ensemble prediction system, the 500 millibar height anomalies for 26 October. So that would basically be, what's that, about 11 days from now. Generally showing, again, that anomalous ridge and the persistent trough. These features seem fairly persistent. So over Hudson Bay, you got this ridge axis extending up into higher latitudes toward the Arctic with this particular image. And then that Gulf of Alaska, that troughing continues, moves a little bit closer by the 26th of October to the west coast of Canada and the Pacific Northwest. But this is something we need to keep an eye on. We look at the teleconnections, we see what we're supposed to, what they usually favor, and then we look at the upper level charts, these weather charts, to see how it's matching up. Is it matching up? Can we tell if one of these teleconnections is more dominant based on the hemispheric circulation pattern? So it's really interesting stuff. Just adding this into these as well, get you familiar with what's going on in the hemispheric pattern. So here's my final thoughts for tonight's video and this week's teleconnection discussion. All right, so bottom line, MGO is currently in phase 6, and it's going transitioning to a null phase and then to phases 2 and 3 through the 28th of October. Now, phase 2 generally indicates cooler temperatures across the eastern U.S., while phase 3 indicates milder temperatures across the eastern U.S., and then if it's in the null phase, it just indicates minimal impacts in general. It does not favor cold nor warm temperatures in a null phase. Very limited influence. The La Nina conditions across the equatorial eastern Pacific are here, and right now we're looking at 0.7 degrees Celsius below normal water temps in that Niño 3.4 region. And as a reminder, La Nina favors mild temperatures across the mid-Atlantic for the upcoming winter season. The sea surface temperature anomalies, we're keeping a close eye on that. There's cooler than normal water across the Gulf of Alaska, down along the west coast of the United States. That's indicative of a negative or cold phase PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And that generally favors mild temperatures across the southeast and mid-Atlantic. Okay. So we're keeping an eye on those water temperature anomalies in the Pacific Ocean especially. Additionally, the models are indicating a negative trend in the AO and the NAO, and that's going to transition to neutral conditions and then to slightly positive conditions. So, for example, with the AO, with a negative trend, we'd expect cooler temperatures over the eastern U.S. to near average conditions, and then slightly above average with a positive AO. And then with the NAO, going from negative cooler temperatures over the east coast to neutral average temperatures, and then slightly positive phase of the NAO, that will result in more of a zonal flat jet stream, which will result in near average temperatures. So just keep an eye on these things. And models are generally indicating a major shift in the PNA pattern from a negative PNA to a positive PNA. This is very important to our jet stream configuration. Generally, we have milder temperatures with a ridge across the eastern U.S. with a negative PNA, transitioning to a trough and cooler temperatures across the eastern U.S. as that PNA becomes positive. Models are indicating a potential or indicating a positive, then a negative, then back to positive trend in the Eastern Pacific Oscillation, that EPO. So we'd expect fairly mild temperatures across the eastern U.S. with the positive phase. And it looks right now that the positive phase, the EPO, is going to be more predominant. And what does that mean again? That means that troughing there in the Gulf of Alaska and northeastern Pacific is going to stick around. We don't see that being replaced with a negative EPO where we get this huge upper level ridge to build into Alaska. At least not yet. Additionally, the model sudden stratospheric warming and the weakened stratospheric polar vortex in later October, the last part of October. And that would give us cooler temperatures across the eastern U.S. possibly in November. Now I say the word possibly because with any weakening of a stratospheric polar vortex, there's a couple major pieces we need to talk about. First, just because you have a warming in the stratosphere and you have a weakening polar vortex, and we get these planetary waves to move from the troposphere up into the stratosphere to perturb that polar vortex and knock it off its position off the polar area, doesn't necessarily mean that the troposphere and stratosphere, that energy transfer, is going to actually happen. All right. There could be a case where these things just don't, the troposphere, stratosphere, the energy just doesn't couple. And if that happens, that means we'd have very minimal impacts to the weakening stratospheric polar vortex. Additionally, not all events are exactly alike. There's been some great examples in the past winters where we generally get cooler temperatures over into Eurasia and very little impact in eastern United States. Or we have a case like in February of 2021 where we get a very impactful event all the way down to the Texas Gulf Coast where the temperatures are extremely frigid and just not normal, obviously, for the folks living in Texas. So, bottom line is we'll continue to watch this sudden stratospheric warming and we'll also continue to watch the possible impact for the weakened stratospheric polar vortex. And keep in mind, too, that in general, the research has shown 30 to 45 days after the weakening is usually when you see the cooler temperatures. Another thing to mention is this thing is happening so early, the weakening. Again, that this time of year is cooler. It's getting cooler and cooler as we continually lose daylight hours. But comparing a stratospheric polar vortex weakening in October and November is much different than, let's say, a midwinter stratospheric warming event where we get the effects in January and February. So just keep that in mind as well. The overall assessment based on tonight's teleconnections, again, NOAA declares the La Nina has officially arrived. They just put out a message recently, I believe it was yesterday, and so it's here. The MJO is here. MJO remains weak, favoring cool temperatures initially with milder temperatures and longer range as we move into phases 3, if that pans out in the forecast. And then sea surface temperature anomalies with a negative PDO favor milder temperatures for the eastern U.S. The AO and NAO, again, moving toward a neutral state and slightly positive. That's going to favor cooler temperatures in the short term, but then those cooler temperatures are going to be replaced by milder air, near average, even possibly slightly above average, depending if, what that magnitude is of the positive phase for AO and NAO. The Pacific North American, the PNA pattern, is going to transition from a negative to a positive state with a pattern change again to a trough and cooler temps in the eastern U.S. We can see that on the models, right? If you notice, I'm not showing you this weekend's models or early next week. The graphic on the left is mid next week. So by that point, the trough has moved off the eastern U.S., off the coast. But we are expecting a really good cool down with the transition to a positive PNA pattern. Additionally, the EPO, the Eastern Pacific Oscillation, is forecast to average out near neutral, positive, negative, positive. This is going to favor neither warm nor cold temps in the eastern U.S., and while that stratospheric polar vortex SPV weakens by the end of October. So right now, again, with that polar vortex weakening, it's just too early to tell the true implications of it. So we'll continue to watch that. We'll see if that energy coupling occurs between the troposphere and the stratosphere. So overall, what we're expecting is cooler temperatures across the eastern U.S. in the short term. Late this weekend through the middle of next week, and then returning more close to slightly, near average to slightly above average temperatures. Precipitation looks to remain below normal, at least over the next 5 to 7 days. It looks dry, outside of occasional frontal passages moving through the mid-Atlantic. And then, there's been hints at the model, the consistency is really not there, of potential coastal storm, as we get closer to the last week of October. That's all going to depend upon, the overall upper level flow, the pattern, as far as the amplification of, a long wave trough, for example, and then some mid-level energy moving in as well. Do we have increased dynamics? All right. That wraps things up tonight on the video Teleconnections discussion this week. A lot of interesting things to keep an eye on. And just in summary, I'm most interested in a few things in tonight's video that I think will be playing into the upcoming weather. Obviously, the La Nina, the NOAA will be issuing their official winter outlook next week, and there's a pretty good chance that the seasonal forecast for the winter is going to be milder. Typical La Nina pattern for the U.S., dry southwestern U.S. up through southeast to the mid-Atlantic. It's going to be warmer than normal and drier than normal in that same area. And then cooler than normal back to the northwest, the Pacific Northwest, and northern plains. There's a good bet that's probably what you're going to see. But this La Nina update's huge. Reading the latest discussion by NOAA, the Climate Prediction Center, and what they're indicating is more of a potential for a moderate La Nina this winter. So it's very similar to last winter, really, the forecast. I'll also be really curious to see how the stratospheric polar vortex weakening, does that energy translate down towards the troposphere? If it does, then I would anticipate this Arctic oscillation to eventually start trending back negative as we head into November. But again, it's a matter of does the coupling happen between the stratosphere back down to the troposphere, or does it not? All right, and then the same thing would be true of this NAO. If that polar vortex weakening, if that energy, the coupling occurs from the stratosphere to the troposphere, I would expect that the NAO would eventually move toward negative territory as well. All right, so I'll be watching that. Additionally, the PNA forecast, always got to look at the Pacific North American pattern as far as a jet stream configuration, and the EPO, negative versus positive, as well as the polar vortex and the stratosphere polar vortex. This one's really got to be watched. All the models are indicating that warming. Really not much difference either, I was going to mention, in the magnitude of the warming either. Fairly consistent. So the models are definitely in alignment with something going on, the warming occurring in late October. And then again, the QBO. This is very important to me. I think the two wild cards of the winter are going to be this polar vortex behavior, the strength of it, as well as this QBO. And then, how strong does La Nina get? But overall, that wraps things up. I really hope you learn something every week we do the videos. Take care, everybody. Until next time, I wish everybody the best of health. Take care and God bless.